Um, it's a pretty strange time to be a leader, I think. Not just a strange time, but I think it's also the hardest time to be a leader. You look at what's going on in the world, whether you look at wars or polarization or the economy. There was a study that came out fairly recently that even said that a lot of Gen Z and millennials don't even want to be leaders anymore because they don't think it's worth the hassle of getting into that role. Right? It was described as almost an unpaid internship in the article that I came across. So there's a lot going on in the world of leadership, but there's also never been a greater time for us to need leaders to step up and to be the leaders that we all need and all deserve inside of our organizations. Now, if you were to look throughout history, one of the ways that mariners and explorers would find their way to their destinations and to their homes would be through the use of landmarks. Now, over the years, these landmarks became what we now know today as lighthouses. And the whole purpose of a lighthouse was to guide a leader or an explorer to their destination and to help make sure they could get to their destination in a safe way. And I very much think of leaders today inside of organizations as lighthouses. All of you are lighthouses. In other words, your job, your responsibility, your privilege isn't just to build yourself up to become this big, shiny, powerful lighthouse. It's also to guide other people, to guide your people to their destinations, to make sure they get to where they need to be going, but in a safe way. And as a leader, you also have to remember that if there are no ships in the water, then what's the point of a lighthouse? What's the point of you becoming a better leader and focusing on these skills and mindsets for yourself if you're not able to guide those around you? So how do you actually guide those around you? What does it mean to be a leader in this new world of work that we're a part of? Now, the research that I did, I interviewed over 140 CEOs at companies around the world, and I surveyed 14,000 employees. And really, I wanted to understand, is leadership changing? Will the leader of 2030 be that different than the leader of today? And if so, how? Because if leadership isn't changing, then I don't have a book to write. So is leadership actually changing? I'm actually curious, quick show of hands. How many of you think that leadership is changing and it's unrecognizable from where it was 5 to 10 years ago? Okay. How many of you think that a lot of leadership is still the same? In other words, if you were a leader and you did a good job 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, you could be just as effective as you are now. You could be honest. We're all friends here. Nobody. Maybe a little bit. Okay. So it's true. There are some core common elements of leadership that have been around for generations, right? Being able to set a vision, being able to communicate effectively. These are all things that have been timeless for leaders for generations. So when I interviewed these CEOs, the question I asked them is leadership changing? And how is leadership changing? And if you look at the world that we're all a part of today, you can see that the world is changing. You can see that business is changing. We're seeing a big shift and focus towards purpose and meaning and impact. We see the rise of technology, globalization, the changing nature of talent and expectations, multiple generations in the workplace. We're seeing so many changes in the business world. And so as a result, our businesses are changing, which means that we need a new type of leader to guide our organizations now and over the next 5, 20 years. So what does that kind of a leader actually look like? Now, to give you a little bit of context, by 2030, and this is not far away, right? We're talking 6 years from now. There's going to be between 88 million and 440 million leaders in the world. These are people who are responsible for others. People who are responsible for others. If you take that number somewhere in the middle, 220 million-ish leaders around the world. That's a lot of leaders. And so if we want to change our organizations, we want to change our businesses, we want to change our world, it's going to depend on the people that we put in positions of power. It's going to depend on the leaders that we actually have. And think about the impact that a leader has. Leaders fight for social causes. Leaders create jobs. Leaders shape community. They shape society. Leaders have a tremendous impact on employees, not just when they're at work, but also when they go home at the end of each day. I mean, think about a time when you had a bad day. Maybe your leader said something to you that made you upset. Maybe the leader did something that made you upset. You don't just leave that emotion at home. You take that emotion, or you don't just leave that emotion at work. You take that emotion home with you. And so when you get home and your wife or your husband, your significant other says, "How was your day?" You're not all of a sudden going to say, "Oh, everything is fantastic." You're going to be upset, frustrated. So we always think that a leader only impacts the lives of an employee at work. But the reality is that all of you have a tremendous impact on the lives of your employees outside of work as well. And we all know what it feels like to work for a great leader. And we also know what it feels like to work for a bad leader. I've worked for a lot of bad leaders. That's why I'm on this stage. That's why I don't have a job, because I always worked for bad leaders. And when I would show up to work in the morning, I would get that uncomfortable feeling in my stomach. I wouldn't sleep well. My heart would be beating quickly. I didn't want to show up to work. So when you work for a bad leader, you don't feel like anybody has your back. You don't feel like you're supported. You don't feel like you're encouraged. You don't feel like you're going to show up to work with your best ideas. You don't feel like you want to show up to work and identify new opportunities for your team. But similarly, we also know what it feels like to work for a great leader. And when you work for a great leader, you feel like you can do anything. When you work for a great leader, you feel like you can be yourself. You feel like the leader has your back. You feel like you're supported, like you're encouraged. You feel like you're learning, you're growing, you're developing. This gives you more purpose and meaning, not just at work, but also in your life in general. Because so many of us get our sense of purpose and meaning from work. We spend more time working than pretty much doing anything else. So how you feel in the relationships that you have at work and how your leader treats you at work also has a very profound impact on your life as well. So I mentioned I interviewed 140 CEOs at companies all over the world. Mainly large organizations that you've all heard of, like an Oracle, a Unilever, a MasterCard, a Best Buy, a KPMG, lots of big global brands. And also surveyed these 14,000 employees around the world. And I did this because I was really interested in understanding the relationship between how CEOs see leadership changing versus how employees who actually work for these CEOs see leadership changing. So I'm going to share a little bit of both. I'm going to share what CEOs shared with me. And then towards the end, I'm going to give you some of the quantitative data from these 14,000 employees that we surveyed. So the first question that I asked all of these CEOs at companies around the world, and it's the question that I want you to think about, is what is leadership and who is a leader? How would you explain leadership to somebody? How would you explain what it means to be a leader to somebody? So this was the first question that I asked all of these 140 CEOs. And some of the responses I got back from these executives were, "Nobody's ever asked me that before," or "That's a good question," or "I'm not sure, I need to think about that for a minute." And I thought, well, that's strange, because you're running a global company where you have thousands of employees, where you're responsible for billions of dollars, and you can't explain and define what it means to be a leader. Then I realized why this is the case. Because leadership is everywhere. It's ubiquitous. And because it's everywhere, we never take a step back to actually explain and define what it means. You see leadership everywhere you go every day. You see it when you check in at your hotel, when you get on a flight, when you go to the grocery store, when you turn on the news, when you watch sports. You see leadership in some capacity everywhere. And because it's everywhere, we never take time to try to explain and define what it means. It's almost like trying to explain to somebody what water is. Have you ever had to explain to somebody what is water? I mean, I have two kids, a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old. They've never asked me, Daddy, what is water? Because it's everywhere. We know intuitively kind of what it is, but we never actually define it. I think is going to be crucial for all of you in this room is for you, for yourselves, for your teams to define what does it mean to be a leader. And oftentimes when I ask organizations to do this exercise and I bring a lot of their executives together, I get a lot of different definitions. Some executives talk about leadership is about performance and shareholder value and meeting the objectives of the company. Other people might tell me that leadership is about values and culture and putting people first. And the way that you define leadership will dictate the type of culture that you create, the type of team that you have, the type of people that you attract. And I was always really interested in I would go to some organizations and I would notice that in one company, there would be a lot of leaders who everybody would love. Everybody would want to work for these leaders. They say these leaders are great and motivating, engaging, impactful, inspiring. But in that same company, there would also be leaders that everybody hated. There would also be leaders that everybody was scared of, that nobody wanted to work for those leaders. So how does that make sense? Because it's one company, it's one set of values, it's one mission, one vision. Yet in that same company, you have leaders who everybody loves and admires and respects, and leaders who everybody fears and is scared of and doesn't want to work for. So people get into the positions that they're in. It's because the people who promoted them had different definitions of leadership. So the way that you define leadership will dictate the type of culture that you create. And this is why it's important to be on the same page of what you as a company, how you as an organization view and define leadership. Because if you view it and define it in different ways, you will have different types of leaders.